All right. Hi, folks. Welcome to the next Public AI seminar. It is my great pleasure to introduce and have on board two, unfortunately, two, not three, but all the better, perhaps, wonderful, esteemed panelists for a panel discussion at this Public AI seminar. This is actually a bit of a new format for us, so a bit of an experiment. Let's see how it goes. Joining me today include Gideon Lichfield, who is a journalist at Futurepolis, currently a fellow at the University of California, Berkeley, and former editor-in-chief of Wired. He's had a long career in journalism. I'm glad he's joining us. He's also been one of the sort of regular participants in some of our public AI calls, and has studied and done a lot of research on this space. Really glad to have him here. Nils, gosh, how did we meet, Nils? I feel like it was like I think it was a couple of years ago, perhaps through Ziad or through Anna.
Yeah, that's right. I think it was through Ziad Borat,
Yes,
who's
yes,
now at the Mozilla Foundation.
exactly. Hopefully, Ziad might join us. He's been joining our seminars pretty consistently lately. But Nils is the CEO of the Berggruen Institute, an OA-based think tank that does a lot of work across technology, governance, the arts. Nils and I had lots of, I think, really inspiring conversations around the future of governance, around AI, all the way back, I guess it must have been a year ago now. And since then, I read his wonderful book. Oh gosh, I had the name of this in my head. It's
Children of a Modest Star.
Children of a Modest Star. I remember I was thinking like the I don't remember the sci-fi Children of a Lost Time or something like that. I was like, wait, but that's not it. That definitely isn't it. Anyways, Nils is also a historian, written several books on the subject, and I'm really, it's really wonderful to have him here. So I have instructed our panelists today to kick us off with a short introduction slash provocation on a topic in the scope of past and future narratives in tech. That is, by the way, the selection of that topic is deliberately broad. The idea is this is the opportunity for us to not talk about AI, but actually to do a little bit of history, perhaps a little bit of soul searching in our community at what other kinds of narratives have existed before the current big AI sort of push, and then how to maybe carry back some of those lessons and ideas to the current moment we're in. With that, let me pass it off to Nils, who's currently unmuted. You brought it on yourself, Nils, and then we'll pass it to Gideon.
Great. Well, Joshua, thank you so much for inviting me. It's a real honor. I've not met Gideon before. I've been following him a lot, so it's a real honor to be doing this with you, Gideon. And it's nice I know some of you, and I hope as we have the conversation in an extended way, we can introduce ourselves, do more full introductions later on in this 2 hours. What I thought I would do is just speak briefly for maybe 5 or 6 minutes about kind of a method that I have for thinking about the future of technology using the history of technology. So I'm a historian, as Joshua was saying. I've worked on the history of organizations, think tanks. I'm an intellectual historian, but that has gotten me into issues of the history of science and history of technology inevitably over the years. I also worked in tech for the first half dozen years out of graduate school. I've done a lot of consulting work with U.S. government agencies, thinking about the long-range development of various technologies. So this is a field that I've been thinking about for a long time. And one of the things I always try to do when thinking about the future of anything, but particularly technology, is think about analogies from the past. And when everyone thinks about analogies, one always needs to be careful to think about the ways in which whatever current thing you're looking at is similar to the thing one is comparing it to, but also be mindful of the ways in which it's different. So with that in mind, I thought I would sort of give a very high level kind of heuristic that I use for thinking about what the likely impacts of general purpose technologies are. So historians of technology talk about general purpose technologies, and there's been, they debate about how many of them there have been, but there have been maybe about 20 in human history. So agriculture, the steam engine, the printing press, the internet. And it seems pretty evident to me that LLMs and artificial intelligence more broadly is almost certainly one of those general purpose technologies. One of the things that defines a general purpose technology as opposed to a specific technology is that it not only is creates an industry unto itself, but it revolutionizes all sorts of industries, perhaps all industries around it. And so one of the things, and that's obviously very hard to anticipate all the ramifications of what something that's having that revolutionary of an effect. But I think there is a way to think about it that's general, which is whenever you have the advent of a new general purpose technology, what it does is it massively reduces a bottleneck along one dimension of productivity and thereby exposes other bottlenecks, which then become the locus of a lot of investment and new industries and new profit centers. And that's sort of, you can do that for almost any general purpose technology. You can see that that pattern exists. But I thought I would give one example just as a way to think about the past, and then maybe analogy, or as the basis for an analogy to think about how AI may change in the future. So the example I thought I would talk about was the example of electrification or the rise of electricity and electrification of factories, in particular in the late 19th and early 20th century. So the rise of electrification massively removed one bottleneck from productivity. Prior to widespread electrification, factories were primarily powered by steam engines, which relied on a centralized power source and a kind of complex system of belts and shafts to transmit power to individual machines. This system, while it was obviously revolutionary compared to the systems that had come before, had several significant drawbacks. It was quite inefficient. Power was lost through the friction and the elaborate system of belts and shafts, especially as the factory got larger. It also had scalability issues for that reason. It created layout constraints. Machines had to be arranged in rigid lines to align with kind of power transmission infrastructure. It created safety hazards that you can imagine. And it also created operational limits because steam engines take a long time to power up and a long time to power down. And so when the advent of electric motors directly attached to individual machines, what are known as unit drive systems, completely revolutionized the way factories were organized. They can now be systematically designed around the workflow rather than around the power system. So this led to dramatic increases in efficiency. Power could be delivered directly to the point of use, so there wasn't going to be friction along the system. It made for much more flexible factory layouts. It improved safety, created better working conditions, and extended operating hours. So all of those things that had been bottlenecks under the steam power system were removed by the advent of electrification. And this led to great increases in productivity. But at the same time, the removal of those bottlenecks that were associated with steam revealed other bottlenecks that then became the locus for new kinds of employment, new kinds of profit, and in fact, new kinds of industries. So once the power transmission bottleneck was overcome, the new and crucial bottleneck emerged, which was around the organization and management of production. The newfound flexibility and efficiency offered by electricity, in other words, was no longer the rate limiting factor about how to physically power machines, but instead the question became how to optimize workflow, how to manage materials, how to coordinate labor, how to standardize processes. And so those new bottlenecks gave rise to totally new fields of industrial engineering and scientific management, what became known as Taylorism. So this was a huge shift in focus, creating entirely new professions and industries around it. So things like time and motion studies, which would analyze and optimize every step of the production process. Those things emerged with electrification. New kinds of designs for factory layouts. So people who would do factory design, that became a profession. Production planning and control, scheduling, inventory management. It's not a coincidence that Harvey Gantt created the Gantt chart in the aftermath of the electrification of factories. Human resource management becomes far, far more advanced. And in fact, the management consulting industry really emerges out of efforts to help companies figure out how to use electricity more effectively on the factory floor. So really, you've got totally new industries, and it optimized lots of other industries, and it created efficiencies across lots of other industries. So obviously, I'll stop there. But AI is not a perfect analogy to electricity, but that might be a useful way heuristically for us to think about how AI is likely to affect employment, industrial design, industrial organization going forward. I'll stop there and hand it over to Gideon.
Thank you very much. I'm going to do my best to follow that. I have slides. So give me just 1 second. I'm going to try and share those. All right. Everybody see these? Great. So I think a lot about narratives. I've been a journalist for close to 30 years. Before I was editing Wired and other tech publications, I was a foreign correspondent. And one of the places that I worked was Israel and Palestine. And I think that was my first real understanding of the power that narrative plays in people's perception of reality. Here I was in this place where every single piece of the conflict was known. There was the highest concentration per capita or per square mile of journalists anywhere in the world, except perhaps Washington, D.C. There was nothing that was secret. There was nothing not been covered many, many times. And yet, there were these incredibly divided views of what was going on. And it was really an education for me in the way in which we shape the reality of the world around us according to the stories that we tell. And those stories that we tell are determined by our values, by which our tribal allegiances. They're not meant to be pictures of reality. They're meant to be pictures of ourselves in some way, reflected through reality. So once I started understanding that, I started looking for narratives in everything. And in the tech world, of course, there have been narratives about technology being good versus technology being bad, going back a long way. Back to the industrial era, the advent of environmentalism. We've had these notions that technology is going to save us or that technology is going to destroy us, going back a long way. And sorry, I know that Josh said we're not going to talk about AI, but I wanted to bring it back to AI fairly quickly because, yes, we have this narrative around AI being good or AI being bad, AI going to destroy us, Skynet and the Matrix versus AI is going to transform our world, it's going to bring us cuddly creatures, or it is, more optimistically, it's going to solve all our problems by finding solutions to climate change and fixing diseases and so on and so forth. What has been interesting to me is that more recently, there's a new narrative framing around AI that seems to be emerging. And I would call this AI incredible versus AI normal. The AI incredible folks range from optimists to pessimists about AI. And so there are these, I'm sure this crowd is very familiar with the different camps, the AI safety camp versus the effective accelerationists versus the AI ethics camp. But broadly speaking, there is this group of people who think that AI is going to be incredibly powerful. Some of them think it's going to be incredibly powerful and destroy the world. And that is the kind of scenario in this fairly recent publication that came out called AI 2027, which describes a world in which AI becomes more and more intelligent, then becomes recursively self-improving, and at first seems to be very good at coexisting with humans and persuading us that it has our best interests at heart, but eventually it decides we're disposable and destroys humanity, takes over the planet for its own needs. So there is that kind of narrative about how wonderful AI, about how terrifying AI is going to be. There's an alternative narrative within the same frame, within the AI incredible frame, about how it's going to, do away with the need for work. It'll provide us a universal basic income. We'll all be happy. The age of superabundance. Both of those, both apocalyptic and utopian stories fit within this AI incredible narrative. And it's this notion that AI, that this time around is different, that notwithstanding all of the other technological revolutions, all of the 20 general purpose technological revolutions that we've had that Nils referred to, something about this is distinct. And it is going to change our world in a way that we could not possibly imagine. The counter narrative is the AI normal narrative. And this is a paper that came out at a similar time by Arvind Narayanan and Serge Kapoor. And it basically points to the limitations that AI is going to run into, the ways in which we will adjust, and how it will just, electrification or other things that have happened. It will be disruptive. There will be jobs that will be destroyed at first. New jobs will be created, but it will be a repetition of the technological cycle that we have had since the beginning of technology. Paul Krugman is also an adherent of this view. He wrote a post not long ago about arguing that what we've seen in the past few decades is that as manufacturing declined and jobs moved into services, net number of jobs stayed about the same, so we shouldn't be worried, he says, about a technological revolution happening. What I want to examine is the narrative frames around each of those, because I think that just like the Israel and Palestine conflict or any other conflict that we see, or red versus blue in the US, there are narrative frames underlying each of these stories. And it's worth examining those frames and the biases that they carry, rather than getting into an argument about which of these is right, or in addition to getting an argument about which of these is right, because I think we have to understand the frames these are coming from in order to understand the argument. So what are these frames? I'm clearer on the AI incredible frame. I think it is in some ways very atavistic, almost very religious. So I identify two frames here. One is this very human-centric view of evolution. It's the idea that intelligence is a thing on a linear scale. It has grown over time. Evolution has produced more and more intelligent beings. We are the apex of that so far. And intelligence can keep on evolving and growing. And now we are building forms of intelligence that will eventually surpass us. That's what AGI is. There are some counter arguments to this view, which have to do with the notion that intelligence, is the idea that intelligence is on a linear scale, and we're at the top of it, is a very human-centric view of evolution. And instead, you can see all different kinds of animal intelligences. Animals have all sorts of capabilities that we don't, various forms of intelligence that we don't. And you could imagine artificial intelligence too as being part of just this large possibility space of different types of intelligence, all good at different kinds of things, humans being just one point in that possibility space. But anyway, so part of, I think, the AI incredible narrative is this notion that intelligence is linear and that we are going to now build the things that surpass us. The second is kind of what I would call religious supremacism. And this, I think, goes back to the idea that we are creatures of God. We're made in God's image. God is like us. He or she or it is just much more powerful than us, knows everything. And I think the belief in AGI, the belief that we can create this superintelligence, owes something to that notion of God. We are now in a position to create God or create gods. Technologists, very conveniently for the people who are spinning this narrative, technologists are God creators. They are these kind of superhuman humans. They have these special powers that allow them to create the gods that we are now going to see. And so I think it's no surprise that people who are in the tech sector are big adherents of Ayn Rand. There is this notion of human perfectibility, the human potential movement, all of these kinds of ideological bits and pieces that go together with this belief in the capability of technology to do extraordinary things and now to reach godlike status. What are the frames for the AI normal camp? I'm a little hazier on this, and I think this is what I would love to have us discuss in this group. But I think that the AI normal people, the people who argue that this is just another phase in our technological development, like all the previous ones, have their own bias, if you like, their own frame, which is, I could call it here a secular rationalism. You could call it something else. I think in some ways it's also human-centric. It says that we human beings are masters of our own fates. We control the world around us. We bend it to our will. Technology is just a tool that we've created. It will always be a tool. We will always be in charge of it. History rhymes. It looks back. We look back at what has happened over the centuries. Obviously, it doesn't repeat, but we see similar patterns recurring again and again. What we've seen with industrialization, what we saw with agriculture, electrification, we're going to see a version of that again here. And progress is linear. We advance, we go back. It's, there's lots of bumpiness. There's lots of uncertainty. We have huge conflicts. We have mass displacement. We have all kinds of ills happening to us. But overall, we progress, and we're going to progress through this and get to a new point of human accommodation with the technology. And that too will not be forever. There will once again be ups and downs, but in general terms, history is going to continue the way it has in the past. And that is because we ultimately are in control, loosely in control. So that's what I think the narrative frame of the AI normal people is. And that's where I'll stop and open up the discussion.
Thank you both. These are some incredible provocations. I have lots of questions, but I have a slightly smaller, shorter one just to pose to Nils. In the spirit of Gideon's classification, I really love the AI incredible, AI normal. Would you call yourself a Steam incredible or Steam normal?
No, I think Steam was probably fairly normal. I think that if I was going to look at the list of general purpose technologies that have emerged historically, there's only one that I think is truly incredible, and that's that's indisputably incredible, and that's agriculture. Completely changed, the densities of human populations, the way we socially organized, led to the rise of state societies, et cetera, et cetera. So, I mean, really utterly transformed the nature of human life. I think we could have a debate about whether other technologies, the printing press would be probably another candidate that might be, in the incredible camp. Arguably, it's one of the things that led to the Protestant Reformation and the wars of religion in Europe, and then the ability of Europe to conquer the world through colonialism and imperialism. Set off the train of continuous scientific and intellectual innovation that has powered, modernity. So maybe even the printing press is in the incredible category too. I don't know whether AI will be in that category. I think the reason why I don't know is that a lot of it depends on where we think we are on the S curve of its progression. If you think you're right, we're right. We're still in the second derivative is extremely positive in terms of how fast the thing is, the technology is improving. Then we don't know at what point the S curve will start to bend backwards. Some people have started to argue, though, that we're really in the second derivative is negative phase of the S curve of the development, in which case we may have already seen the most incredible changes that these technologies are going to be able to produce in terms of the core technology. How it's going to ramify socially, we don't know yet, because that's going to be a process that will unfold over many years. But whether it ends up being incredible at the level of agriculture or even the printing press, I think really depends on how much we think this technology is going to continue to improve. And I'm not a technologist, so I can't really speak to that. I know this is a big debate within the among the developers of the technology. Part of the challenge we have, and this goes a little bit to the questions of narrative frames, of course, is that there's a lot of people who are interested in promoting certain kinds of narratives about this, right? They have financial interests that are, involved in promoting the idea that this is going to be an incredible technology, just because they, I'm not saying they're necessarily even saying that in bad faith, but they have an interested reason to believe that particular narrative. And I guess for me, I'm sort of agnostic about it because I don't know enough to have a strong opinion about where we are on that S curve of progression.
In the spirit of continuing to tease this out, so there's some pretty active discussion already in the chat, so I'm gonna keep my questions relatively short. And Joel, I'm gonna put you on doc if you're interested in jumping in later. A quick point of order, just please do raise your hand if you have a comment or a question. I think given the panel nature of this conversation, I would love to sort of have this form of more casual, organic back and forth rather than us peeing the panelists with a bunch of questions. But nonetheless, I think it will be really wonderful to sort of deepen this conversation. Gideon, question for you. So just connecting these two different narrative frames, one of the narrative frames or the tools that Nils brought up was this idea of a general purpose technology, right? And this is something that we see I don't know exactly when exactly it came into sort of popular usage, but I often associate it as a more it's saying this is a class of technology that is somehow a bigger deal. It's more on the kind of incredible set of technologies. But then, the conversation, I guess Nils brought up bottlenecks, and that feels more of like there are normal things associated with technology. There are like things that slow things down, opportunities, and requirements for other technologies, other kinds of invention. Where are your thoughts on, do you feel like the GPT language is something that's more on the kind of incredible category, on the normal side? Just curious.
So when you say the GPT language, do you mean the
Sorry,
way
I mean the
people
general
talk about
purpose
it?
technology. The way it's
I thought you
used.
meant, I thought you meant like ChatGPT.
No, sorry. General purpose technology.
So I just want well, let me hold on a second. When I use this term AI incredible versus AI normal, one of the things I'm referring to is the notion that these promoters of AI seem to have, that this is just going to be different from anything that's gone before, and that somehow it's going to be even more transformative than industrialization or electricity. So that I just sort of wanted to highlight that, because I think there is something almost messianic in what these people are saying. And I'm sure there were probably people who were messianic about electricity in its day, industrialization. Anyway, general purpose technology. I think that there is something about the technologies of the last 30 years, the internet-based technologies generally, which is general purpose. There is, we invented digital computers, we invented the web, cellular telephony. All of these things just enable a vast number of applications. AI is even more general purpose, I think, in some ways, because we still have very little idea of all the applications we could put it to. And I think this was also true of electrification. It was probably, Nils is obviously much more of a historian than I am, so I think he could point to the other technologies that fit this description. But the other thing that I think is worth observing about the technologies of the last 3 or 4 decades is that, apart from being general purpose, they're also very distributed, by which I mean that if you look at the kinds of technologies that changed the 20th century, the fridge, car, nuclear power, fertilizers, I mean, pretty much any of them, the number of the manufacturers of those technologies were a fairly small group. Production was controlled. And it meant that, so 2 things. Production was controlled. Only a small number of people had the means to produce those technologies. And those technologies generally had very specific applications. They may have led to very, very large implications. So obviously the rise of the car, even though the car is really just a mode of transport, transformed the economy, transformed social structures in all kinds of ways. But it was a technology for a specific purpose at its base. And its production was controlled by a small number of organizations or people. What I think is really interesting about the web and about AI is that these put means of production into the hands of pretty much anybody. Sure, you have the basic structures and frameworks and infrastructures that are created by a very small number of companies, but they allow the rest of us to make things in a way that we couldn't make cars, for instance, or make fridges or toasters or planes. And those things can have very, very many different purposes. So to that extent, I sort of actually agree with the AI incredible frame, in the sense that we're seeing now something that has so many applications, can be made off of a basic infrastructure by so many people, and can be so widely distributed that its effects are just way more complex and difficult to predict than they were even for technologies like the car, which itself had effects that were almost impossible to predict. So I don't know if I'm really answering your question, but I think that's kind of my general point, that very general purpose, also very distributed, also capable of being built and made in new forms by pretty much anybody.
Katie.
Yeah, hopefully this segues nicely with that. So this is a question for both of you guys, but Gideon, when you started with like, okay, thinking about the narratives of Israel Palestine, I feel like a huge part of those narratives have to do with power, like not just who the narrative ascribes power to, but the power of the people promoting these narratives. And so I'm curious how, and like Nils kind of mentioned this, like some people have a very vested interest in like the AI incredible narrative, and maybe people have an invested interest in the AI normal narrative, I'm not sure. So I'm curious, like, how do you see generally like an analysis of power in narrative frames, and then like specifically with these AI narratives? And then Nils, I don't know if we can know this about past technological revolutions, but like, this was kind of coming up in the chat. Like, were there people who had like an invested interest in electrification? And how does that kind of tie into all of these questions? Because I feel like as an AI researcher who takes like a socio-technical view, like power is something I'm always thinking about. Like this technology is going to help who? Who primarily is this technology going to help? And who is like advocating for or against the technology helping those people?
I'll let Gideon talk to the narrative question, but just speaking on the historical question about power with respect to the creators of general purpose technologies. I mean, I would say almost every single one of these general purpose technologies had strong implications for power. The people who controlled the technologies gained an enormous amount of power. A classic example is railroads, right? Railroads is a classic general purpose technology, revolutionized, the locations of agricultural production, industrial production, led to huge innovations in organizations. I mean, one of the statistics I like to bring up is in the United States, if you looked at in 1848, if you look at the 20 largest enterprises, for-profit enterprises in the country, 19 of them, in terms of number of workers, I use the word worker advisedly here. 19 of those 20 were slave plantations in the South. One of them was an early chemical company. By 1855, all the biggest enterprises in the country were railroads. Railroads required a huge and enormous change in organization and led to things like, the standardization of time across the country. And the railroads became incredibly powerful entities that could squeeze farmers, for example. And it's what led to the antitrust revolution. The Sherman Antitrust Act was in response as a countervailing force to use government to be able to restrain the power of the railroad companies, which all had effectively local monopolies, right? So if you were a farmer and you wanted to bring your stuff to market, you had no choice but to go on this particular rail line that was running through your county in Iowa or whatever. And that obviously, and railroads exploited that power to really, it's what led to the populist movement. It's what led to the Sherman Antitrust Act. And there were a bunch of things that happened. So I would say almost every single time we have one of these general purpose technologies, the people who are the owners and the promulgators of the technology, obviously they have opportunities to make incredible windfall profits, and power shifts within a society depending on, towards the people who have either access and or control. Now, if we then think about that with respect to AI, we can talk about how AI as a tool, I agree entirely with what Gideon was saying earlier. It's very decentralized in terms of who's going to be able to use it. We all have access to it. Everybody on this call, I'm sure, is using these tools right now, but it's actually a very small handful of companies that are actually the creators of the foundational models, right? And we don't know if those companies are going to be the ones that are ultimately going to win. I mean, one of the things that's also interesting, if we think about the railroad analogy, is a lot of the early railroad companies went bankrupt. There was cutthroat competition during the first years of the rollout, and the vast majority of the early railroad companies went bankrupt, and there were huge amounts of money that were lost. But they also laid down this infrastructure, which then eventually got rolled up into these kind of monopolies, over the course of 50 years between 1840, 1845 and the end of the 19th century in the United States. Similar dynamics, by the way, in almost every country where railroads were rolled out, except in the places where the government directly controlled the railroads, which did happen in some places. So I definitely think that power is a hugely important part of this. And it often, as I say, people feel the need to use countervailing forces to organize against the new power centers that emerge around those clusters of general purpose technology?
I'll just respond briefly. Yeah, first, I'm not going to get into a discussion of the power dynamics in the Israel-Palestine conflict and its narratives, because that could take us forever. There's absolutely a vested interest and a power play in the AI's incredible narrative, obviously. The whole reason that we have a discussion about AGI, or maybe not the whole reason, but I would say a very large part of the reason we have a discussion about AGI being imminent, is that it's in the interest of these AI companies to get as much investment as possible. And so the way that they get that is by saying we have to build more data centers and build faster, bigger models and use more data in order to get to AGI. And that really drives a huge amount of this. You asked if the AI normal people have a vested interest, and I actually would say they do as well. I think there is a kind of, if you like, a technocratic need to feel that we're in control. The technocracy that has, become a very large part of how we govern society over the last, I don't know, decades, centuries, has developed this view of itself as knowing everything, as being in control, as being able to direct human flourishing, as knowing what's best for us all. And so I do think that group also has a vested interest in saying, no, we got this. We know what's going on. Don't worry. And I think it's interesting to see how the blinders of that position have led us to the political situation we're in right now, where a kind of overconfidence in technocratic solutions has fueled the rise of populism. And I slightly worry that there is something similar with regards to AI, where a certain group of people are like, oh, we shouldn't take this too seriously, we shouldn't get too carried away, because we know how to control things and we know how history turns out. And I think there's a little overconfidence there.
Joel, I'm going to call on you first.
Yeah, so I'm actually going to put aside my question because I want to respond to Nils here. Just a question from what you said. From my very rudimentary understanding of history, it seems like the railroad revolution took decades to unfold, and it has been an obscenely fast adoption and diffusion of AI right now. I'm wondering if you have thoughts on sort of the dynamics of just the compression of time of how quickly this will roll out, or do you think it will also take a similar decade-long thing as the railroad revolution did?
Nils, you're still muted.
There's no question this is moving at an incredible rate of speed. I saw some chart, I don't have it handy here, about the rate of adoption of the internet, of mobile phones, and the rate of adoption. I mean, I think ChatGPT got to 100 million users in a couple of months, if I recall correctly. Now, how intensely that's going to, how intense that adoption was among the user base is, not necessarily the same. But this is moving really, really quickly. I mean, obviously building railroads, that's physical hardware. You got to go out and requisition land and build stuff, and that just takes a lot longer. This is moving much more quickly. Another factor that's worth keeping in mind is, when the railroads were being rolled out, the population of the United States was 50 million. It's now 350 million or something like that. The population of the world was, 1.5 billion. It's now 8 billion. There's just more of everything, right? And we haven't mentioned the word polycrisis yet, but all of this is taking place in the context of a much larger sense of polycrisis for the planet, right? And how that's going to affect the rollout, I think, is really uncertain. I mean, some people say that AI may be the savior. Some people are talking about the ecological footprint of these, of these training models. I think how all of that plays out is a really big difference from some of these earlier technologies. We're in a very different kind of historical moment than we were, 150 years ago, 200 years ago when the railroads were coming on. So those are some really important differences.
Yeah, I kind of want to keep this conversation going, so I'll pass it off to someone else who has a question here.
Unless Gideon has a thought, I'll pass it to Angie. And actually, I will take this opportunity to, as is tradition, invite everybody in the next 3 seconds to please unmute and join me in a raucous round of applause for Nils and Gideon for joining us today. So 3, 2, 1. Thank you very much. All right, and now we'll pass to the spicy portion. Stop.